very good afternoon to you. I'm Howard Feldman. This is the Synthesis Podcast. And today I am speaking to psychologist in private practice, David Abrahamson. The reason that we're chatting this afternoon is because lockdown has been enforced upon us, but we believe that coming soon there'll be some form of easing of the lockdown, and it is most likely to happen in stages. What worries me tremendously is how do we behave in this new world, in this new normal that we're likely to encounter after the end of the lockdown or the end of the partial lockdown. David Abrahamson, a very good afternoon to you. How are you?
Fine, thank you, Howard. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
So you have to be incredibly busy with people who are feeling anxious, but I imagine that your OCD patients are thriving right now. Is that rude?
I think that yes, if you have OCD inclinations, it's going to be. I think you've been given a lot of permission to carry them on right now. But I do think for me there is, as we know, a line in the sand. And I think if you do have some OCD inclinations right now, it's going to come in very handy because, we do want to follow the precautions moving forward that, have been put out as far as hygiene is concerned. But I think there is obviously, a line in the sand. And if those OCD or those kind of obsessive behaviors are going to stop you from functioning in the world, then I think we have a problem.
Okay, so let's just talk about that, because 6 weeks ago, if I went to a coffee shop and I bought myself a cup of coffee and I said, I wanted it in a takeaway, I took my takeaway cup and I cleaned it with my hygienic wipe, somebody would have called you and said, look, I think Howard needs to see you. Today, if I did that, well, assuming coffee shops were to be open, it would be perfectly normal behavior, which means that our very concept of what is normal has been thrown completely out of the water.
Completely out the water. And, this concept of this new normal has been bandied around a hell of a lot. And I think for me, your point is so valid, because I think if someone saw that behavior that you described a couple of weeks ago, it would have been strange. People would have looked and said, I think this person does have obsessive issues. But times have changed completely, and right now, if we would do that kind of behavior now, it would be seen as completely normal and appropriate. So, I think for me, it really is about understanding what the times are demanding and what we need to do. So absolutely, I think moving forward, it is going to be about adapting to a new normal.
How do we ever determine what that is, considering the rate of change, even within this lockdown period? Initially, we were told you don't need masks unless you're sick, because then you don't spread it. Then we're starting to get information, and it would seem that we might have to wear masks. Well, we don't know if that means wearing one at work, wearing one just until you get to work. The whole measure doesn't really, there's no basis. Everything else, we've modeled our whole life on our own behavior. Right now, our modeling is probably as good as the last 24 hours.
And that's why this is causing so much psychological distress, because, we all like predictability and consistency in our lives. And that's what makes us feel safe. If we know how things work, then we know, okay, this is how we need to do things. And that lowers our degree of anxiety. And things have been so fluid over the last couple of weeks that it's hard to keep up on what is required to keep us safe. And I think that goes to the anxiety that people feel, for this potential, unlocking of ourselves, because we don't know how to do this. What are the rules going to be? Who's going to be let out and who isn't? So it creates a huge amount of anxiety. And I think for me, that's really what I think needs to happen moving forward, is that we need some guidelines. And I think, again, obviously we can't have every moment, every move documented, but and instructed. But it's so important that I think we do have some kind of guidelines moving forward about how we go about doing this.
And how to identify when in fact we are going overboard. Because if we think about returning to an office, and we did a bit of a survey at Synthesis, we sent out a questionnaire to the entire company, and we asked them that should lockdown be ended or partial lockdown be ended, would you like to work in the office? Would you like to work at home, or a combination? And it would seem as though people are afraid. Most people choosing some kind of a combination because perhaps that gives them the flexibility or the out if things become a little bit too stressful.
I think that's a normal response, because it's almost like, you dipping your foot in just to get a sense of how, what the temperature is. And I think that would be a healthy way of going about it, is to we know what is familiar now, what has been familiar for the last couple of weeks. We've got into a new way of being. And now suddenly we've asked to step out of that safety. We know what we're doing at home, but we're not quite sure how to do this new normal outside of home. So I think it would be absolutely appropriate to take baby steps, small steps. How is this new normal at work going to function? How do I stay safe out of my house now in my work environment? So I think that kind of approach is absolutely normal. The concern would be if someone says, right, I'm not moving out my house. I'm not going anywhere because of my levels of anxiety, because that would show that the person's immobilized by their anxiety, and feeling really that they need to stay in control of situations and not move in order to be okay. And that's our concern.
I'd like to suggest another reason, and certainly it's one that I've come across with people, and that is the dread or the fear of what happens if I not only catch it because maybe I'm young and I'm healthy, but I've got an elderly parent or elderly parents or somebody who's compromised around me, and I'm the reason that they get sick and God forbid die. That burden is something that I keep hearing as a recurrent theme. So my first question to you is, obviously every case differs, but is that displaced anxiety? In other words, it's really about themselves, but it's easier to verbalize it about somebody else? Or is that a very real concern that people are walking around with, or both?
Well, listen, I think for me, there is a reality to it, that we know that people who are elderly, who have existing conditions, are more susceptible to getting the coronavirus in a serious manner. So I think there's a reality to it. But I also do think, for me, that there are precautions that are very clear that we have been given to take. And I think for me, the point is that if we follow those precautions, I think for me, we really should be have covered ourselves and made sure that the people around us who are more vulnerable are safe. So I think for me, it's also important, because as you said, we look to our own anxiety. Is it maybe something about us that we don't want to get out? And then also, that completely negates the responsibility of the person who needs to protect themselves. So I think for me, it's very important that people understand that there are precautions that they follow, and by restricting themselves will just exacerbate their anxiety even more, because they're going to feel more and more controlled by their anxiety in the kind of, for the goal of being safe.
Yeah, you've mentioned before that in another conversation that we've had on my radio show, that we need to function at a certain level of anxiety, that without anxiety on any level, we basically cease to function. We become immobilized. What do you think has happened if we take those fictitious numbers from 1 to 10? Where were we as a community, or as South Africans, or the people members of the world, and where are we today? Have we seen a tremendous increase in levels of anxiety?
I think there's no doubt. I think we were very anxious before. I think we were having problems with anxiety previously. But I think since this whole coronavirus pandemic, there's no question that the level of anxiety has gone Wow, much, much higher. And we're talking about, 7, 8, 9, and even 10. And that's areas where we get concerned, because those are the areas where people struggle to function in the world. A very healthy anxiety would be, and I've always said, I feel very sorry for the concept of anxiety, because the most successful people have a good, healthy dollop of anxiety. They get things done. They meet deadlines. But as soon as you get past 8, 9, and 10, that's when we start to see anxiety controlling the person and getting overwhelmed. And I do think for me right now, many, many, many people are moving into those numbers.
And what are we seeing with our children?
Very similar, very similar. I think for me, interestingly enough, I think, if you had a child who was fairly adaptable, who was coping really fairly well before the lockdown, it's interesting because children, from what I've seen, have adapted pretty well under the circumstances in general.
That's interesting.
They have communicated and continue to communicate through their games, roadblocks, through their through Fortnite, and of course over their phones. And this is something that they've done in the past. I think, so I think generally children who have been well adapted before are doing okay under the circumstances. I think it's the children who were struggling before with anxiety who are really feeling it the most.
Although that said, issues around social anxiety might have improved somewhat, because there isn't this need to go to a birthday party or to sit in a classroom where you might not be comfortable socially.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, as you say, it's so interesting how people with OCD, who have a level of OCD, are
just
so much more comfortable.
Yes.
Absolutely.
They're thriving right now.
It's so interesting, because I spoke to a young boy a couple of days ago who said, he's loving this because he does have a degree of social anxiety, and he said the only thing he'd want to change is that his parents are not around as much.
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a pain to have social anxiety, and then your parents are home with you all day, can only drive you to drink. Only we can't drink because we can't get alcohol, so that's something completely different. Okay, so David, your advice to anybody listening to this podcast as we head towards hopefully the end or the lightening of the easing of the lockdown.
Mm-hmm. I think it is a very difficult time, and I think for me it's so important to say that if people are feeling lowish in their moods, are feeling anxious, irritable, I think it's completely understandable. We are moving into an unknown period, and I think for me we need to make sure that we understand that it's not something unusual. The majority of people are feeling this way. I would say the first thing to do is, and I know, Howard, we've used this is almost the analogy of a learner driver. I think for me, when you started to drive, you got into the car and everything was very, very automatic. Excuse the pun, in the manual car. You had to think about everything. And it felt like you would never get the hang of this. There were so many things to think about. It took so much energy to actually get the car to move. But with practice, with perseverance, it actually became so natural. And I'll never forget the time where I arrived at a destination and thought, how did I get here? That was quite amazing. And I think to use that analogy is important, because we are going into a period where there is going to be a lot of conscious actions. We're going to think about everything we're doing, and anxiety around those actions. Am I doing this in the right way? Could I catch the virus if I do this, if I venture out to my coffee shop? And I think every time we go forward and we do something, we have had a corrective experience. We have gone to the coffee shop and we have enjoyed our coffee and been fine. Or we have gone to work and we come home and we are healthy. And the more corrective experiences we have, the less anxiety we're going to feel, and the more automatic it's going to become. We're going to develop, almost like sports people, this muscle memory where what was very unfamiliar is now familiar, and it's a way that things just are. But that transition time is going to be difficult. And therefore, I would say, please be kind to yourself. Do what you need to do to look after yourselves. It might sound like a cliche, but do what you need to do to be kind to yourselves, because this is a very, very difficult time. This transition from the safety of our homes into the environment where we haven't been before. So I would say baby steps, and really just take one small step at a time and have small corrective experiences along the way. And that leads to a lowering of anxiety and a greater sense of confidence in the world.
David Abrahamson, thank you very much. David is a psychologist in private practice. He's been chatting to me on the Synthesis podcast. Coming up on Sunday morning, when I chat to Dr. Anton Myburgh, pulmonologist and specialist physician, we're going to take this conversation a little bit further. And what we're going to ask Dr. Myburgh to do is to assist us in making a list of how to behave when we go into a public space or when we go back to the office. So in other words, if we should wash our hands or sanitize our hands every half hour, then at least we know that is within the realm of behavior that we don't need to be concerned about. If we then find ourselves sanitizing our hands every 2.5 minutes, we know we might have something to be a little bit more concerned about. So do join us on Sunday as well, where we're going to take this conversation that little bit further with Dr. Anton Myburgh. David Abrahamson, thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm Howard Feldman for the Synthesis podcast. Good afternoon.